different concepts. Just a very basic intro to the medium itself. We'll talk about the very basics of color theory and color mixing, and a couple of techniques that I use in every video. We'll briefly go over supplies, but I have a supplies video that goes more into depth on everything. But most importantly, I hope that you'll walk away with understanding the concept of watercolor paint, because I think that will equip you way more in your own art practice. This video is designed to be paused, so feel free to take your time. I recommend watching a section first and then pausing it so that you have time to do your own piece and you're not feeling stressed to keep up with the video. The first thing you'll need is watercolor paint. In the supply video, I talk about pros and cons of different grades of paint, but as a whole, better paint is just better. I use this brand Holbein and I love it. It is on the pricier side. It's not the most expensive, but I find that it just creates really beautiful colors. If you're just getting started, I wouldn't let a price point stop you from starting. So use any brand that you feel comfortable spending money on, but just know that these tubes of paint last a really long time. And the higher quality paints tend to be more concentrated, so they'll last you for a lot longer than a student grade set. Next thing we'll talk about is paper. It's important to invest in a good quality paper. To be sure to opt for actual watercolor paper and not any mixed medium types. It should be the consistency of cardstock, so it should be very thick, and they measure this by grams per square meter. I would be sure to not buy anything under 200 grams per square meter to ensure that it's thick enough. And you have two basic options, cold pressed or hot press. Cold press usually has a little bit more texture, and hot press, the process and how they make it, they actually iron out the bumps, so it's very smooth and yeah, it's very smooth paper. If you choose to do a lot of detail and ink drawings over your art, then you might want a smoother paper, but otherwise it's just your personal preference. Then we'll need some kind of paint tray, paper towels, painter's tape, a pencil. We'll need a big brush. You can also use a sponge. We'll need water, of course. Some people work with two different jars of water, one for washing your brushes out and one for actually mixing your paint. The reason for that is if your water gets muddy, then the colors you're mixing will also get muddy. I find that I end up mixing up the two jars of paint. So I usually just work with one, but I try to be conscious of when the water gets muddy looking, then I'll wash it out. And then you'll need brushes. So again, I talk about all of this in my supply list video, and there are so many brushes and so many options. You can have synthetic brushes, you can have animal hair brushes, you can have synthetic animal hair brushes. You have all different kinds of shapes and sizes for different purposes. Even though there's so many options, I find myself only really using 3 round brushes. And round refers to the shape being round. So the large one I have is a size 16, and then I have a size 8 and a size 2. And between these 3, it gives me a lot of versatility and range with being able to paint something very big or very small. Princeton is a really good brand, and they have a nice range of affordable, good quality brushes all the way up to professional grade with animal hair. I don't use animal hair for ethical reasons, but also because they are super expensive. I usually stick with mid-range brushes. I find that I like the shape of and the feeling of the synthetic brushes more, and I think having a lower price range is nice because when the brushes get damaged, you can replace them. It's just your personal preference. So watercolor is a unique medium because you're always working with an element of transparency. Other mediums have different kinds of pigment which make the paint opaque. And often to get a lighter shade of acrylic or oil painting, you would use white, which would create an opaque layer. So with watercolor, we never use white. To lighten our pigment, we actually just use water. White would be the actual white of your paper. So when you're starting a watercolor painting, you're going to want to be conscious of where are the white areas on my painting and protecting that. If there's anything that's pure white, you are trying to protect that piece of paper as much as you can. The fundamental concept of watercolor is you can always add more color, but you can't take it away. So that's one big difference with watercolor, but it's a critical one to understand the concept. You will slowly work with the lighter shades of paint and slowly work to your darker colors. And this is a unique element of watercolor because acrylic and oil, you would start with darker colors and work your way to the lights. Because you can always add more paint, but you can't take anything off. And that's why watercolor has such a reputation of being a difficult medium, because you can't really erase. So because of that, watercolor tends to be a very minimal and purist medium. That's the very basic concept of watercolor, but it's an important concept to know. But it's actually really fun and playful at the same time, so don't get intimidated. And just the way that the pigment dries by itself is really beautiful, so you don't have to do a lot to make a beautiful work of art. But you can also use watercolor to make really realistic paintings. And I tend to paint a lot more hyper-realistic. And it's just cool that you can have such a minimal medium and you can create these beautiful pieces. So I do love the minimal aspect of it a lot. Okay, so first we're going to get started with just some basics on how to work with watercolor in general. First we're going to talk about how to dilute watercolor pigment. So I'm going to start with some ultramarine blue, and then using my larger brush, I get my brush wet and carry some of this water over to my tray. I'm actually going to use my bigger brush to do this because it's a lot faster. So you want to add the pigment to the water and not the other way around, because that gives you the highest level of control with getting the color that you want. So you'll just get a little bit of the pigment like this, and you'll mix it in the water little by little. And just like that. So the more pigment you add, the darker the color will be, and the more water there is, the lighter it will be. So here we have a pretty strong color, like this. And then if I was to add a little more water, it would slowly get lighter. So there's two techniques that we'll practice, but it all comes down to one simple concept. The idea that when your paper is wet, the color will blend and it will move wherever the paper is wet. And when the paper is dry, the color will just stay exactly where you paint it. Let's briefly talk about color theory. Why is this important and why do you care? This is a really complex and huge topic, so we're not going to go super deeply into this, but I think understanding some basics of how color interacts with each other and how certain colors have certain relationships is really helpful to knowing how to mix your paint and what to look for. So if you look here, you'll see a very tiny color wheel. So you've probably seen this. This is the traditional color wheel, and there are different kinds of color theory, but we will stick with the traditional model. So what you have here is the concept that there are three primary colors. You have red, blue, and yellow. And all of these colors are mixed just by using those three colors. First you have the primary colors, yellow, red, and blue, and these colors sit at a triangle around the color wheel. Then you have secondary colors. These sit in between the primary colors around the color wheel, and secondary colors are when you mix two primary colors in equal amounts. These also sit at a triangle to one another. And then the remaining colors are called tertiary colors. And these are when you mix primary colors in different amounts. So what's interesting about the color wheel as well is the colors between yellow and purple here, these are all warm colors. And then on this side, you have your cool colors. But what's interesting about the colors between red and blue and yellow and blue is that blue is a cool color and yellow and red are warm colors. So these colors here in the middle will be a blend of warm and cool. So for instance, this bright green, even though it's technically a cool color because it's green, it's a warmer green. Whereas on this side you have a cooler green, which is teal, which is dominantly blue. It's just helpful to understand this concept in general. So warm colors are often associated with actual heat and temperature, or fun and joy and more passion, whereas cooler colors tend to be affiliated with cold or shadows or more quiet emotions. A perfect example of this is if you see a painting that's painted in sunlight, it tends to be very warm and yellow and like using these kinds of colors, whereas if you see a painting painted in winter where it's like cloudy, cold, it tends to be all along this side of the spectrum. One thing that I wanted to talk about is how to create balance and contrast on your paintings using color. The colors opposite to each other on the color wheel are called contrasting colors. So understanding the concept of contrast with light and dark, but also within color, is really important to create a balanced painting. Wherever there's contrast, that will be very interesting to your viewer's eye. And this is true with black and white. And I think that is called chiaroscuro. Actually, that was way off. It's chiaroscuro, which means light and dark, where the whitest part of the painting and the darkest part of the painting, where that's right next to each other, will be the most interesting. An example of this is the human eye. This is why we're so interested in looking at people's eyes, because you have the darkest and the lightest point of the face right next to each other. This is also true with color. So when you have really contrasting colors right next to each other, for instance, this blue and this orange, that creates a really high contrast for the eye to look at. If you were to put these two colors right next to each other, it would be a little bit chaotic and a little too intense, where their eye would only go to that spot and it might not travel over the rest of the painting. If you wanted to use this orange, one way of avoiding overstimulating your viewer is to use a color not directly across, but one or two stops over. So this teal with this orange would be a much more calming contrast to look at, and it would draw the viewer's eye. Too much color contrast can be chaotic and overbearing to the viewer, and too little can be a little bit boring. So finding that sweet spot in the middle of colors that are contrasting, but in a way that is harmonious and beautiful and appealing, that is the goal. So one way of doing this is using what's called triadic colors. All the colors at a triangle create a lot of balance within each other. So you have the obvious one of red, blue, and yellow. But if you were to shift the triangle over, you have this teal, this orange, and then a more muted red that sit at different triangle points on the color wheel. So if you feel like your painting is leaning too strongly towards one color, having a look at your color wheel and seeing what other colors might balance that out. So this is just one example of how to use the color wheel in your paintings. The last thing I wanted to talk about is when you mix contrasting colors, this orange and this blue, for example. When two colors sit on opposite sides of the color wheel and you mix them together, they will create neutral versions of one another. And if mixed in equal parts, will create a gray. What I mean by that is, for instance, say we have this very bright red, and we've decided it's too bright. It's way too loud for our taste. A way of calming that down and creating a more neutral version of it is using the color opposite to it on the color wheel. So in this case, that would be this turquoise color. So just by using a tiny bit of this turquoise and mixing it into the red, that will create a earthy, muted version of the red that we already have. So that also works in reverse. So if we had this teal and we decided it was too vibrant, using the color opposite to it on the color wheel, just a tiny bit of red, would tone it down and make it much more muted. This is a really great way of creating your own colors with just a small amount of effort. So I would say try to avoid using paint straight from the tube. And this is why I do recommend beginners to not have too many colors, because it's too tempting just to use the brown color for the tree and the yellow color for the sun. And you want to avoid doing that. You want to get creative. You want to have some relationship between the color and some interaction to create a balanced palette. The last thing I wanted to talk about is when you mix the primary colors together or any other triadic color combination. What happens is you get a very balanced gray color. But instead of having to mix 3 colors together, an easier way of doing that is by mixing my favorite color combination, which is burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. When mixed in equal parts, you have a really beautiful and balanced gray that works really well, whether it's light or dark. You can make it super dark to be a black substitute, or you can use it very light and it's just beautiful for clouds or oceans or shadows. Just a very versatile and earthy color. But this is also a perfect example of seeing how if you use 2 colors opposite on the color wheel, because this is blue and this brown tends to be a little bit orangey, by adding a little bit of brown to the blue, you create these earthy, soft blue colors. And in reverse, by adding a little bit of blue to the orangey brown, you create these soft brown. Understanding why these 2 colors work so well together, this is actually a sneaky way of mixing the primary colors all together just by using 2 tubes of paint. You have the pure blue on this side, and then you have a very warm orange brown, which is a combination of yellow and red. So that's why this color combination works so well. So now we will talk just slightly about value of color. You have all the different hues of color here on your color wheel, but each color actually has value. So value means the darkness or lightness of a color. And you could mix a value chart for each color just like this. So with every single color on the color wheel, you can achieve a gradient similar to this. It's very important to understand the value of your color or the darkness or lightness of that shade, because once you are starting your painting, remember how we talked about in the beginning that we will start painting with very light shades, and then you will slowly work your way to these darker shades. But it can be confusing to know how light or how dark exactly to make it. So this is why having a value scale is super handy and very helpful, because it works as a ruler or a guide to understand how light or dark the color should be. The result is that you will just have a much more realistic product in the end. It's easy to want to jump from these very light tones when your painting is looking washed out without any contrast and jump to the dark tones just to create some contrast so you know your painting will turn out. But it's really important to take our time through these middle tones and just trust the process, and that at the end when you do add the contrast, then it will bring balance to the painting. It does take some practice to learn that skill of taking your time, working through those middle layers. It can feel a little disorienting without having a guide of some kind. Having a value scale is super important when you start painting. Be sure to print one out or check out my video below on how to paint one yourself. And I go into a little more detail on how to use it and why it's so important. Now let's get to doing some practical techniques. Theory. Now let's get started with some practical techniques that you will use on your paintings. And you will also hear me refer to these techniques throughout my videos. So there's 2 techniques that we'll practice, but it all comes down to one simple concept. The idea that when your paper is wet, the color will blend and it will move wherever the paper is wet. And when the paper is dry, the color will just stay exactly where you paint it. Watercolor at its most basic is a play between wet and dry, and allowing color to blend when it's wet and having control of where you want it to be when it's dry, and everything in between. That brings us to the two main techniques that we will talk about in watercolor. Wet on wet is exactly like it sounds. It's when you have a wet brush and wet paper. And wet on dry is when you have a wet brush and dry paper. So we will experiment between these two, learn the pros and cons of both, and when is the best time to use which technique. So I'm going to go ahead and tape down my paper onto my board, and I'm going to create a couple of squares in the process. For most of this lesson. If you haven't already, get some water and bring it to your palette, and you're going to mix some of this into the water until you have a pretty strong and even color. So we're looking for a color that is about this strong, or maybe just a slightly darker. The first thing we're going to do is paint a wash, and this is when you get a consistent color throughout a space. We're going to try this using two different techniques, a wet on wet technique and wet on dry. So we're going to start with doing a wash with wet on wet. So the goal is to create an even color throughout this square. So we're going to start with getting our paper wet with our paintbrush. And then once the paper is wet, you're going to bring some paint over and spread that out over this square. So while your paper is wet, you have a lot of flexibility and freedom to move this pigment all the way around. You can see that it moves very freely. So if you get too much paint on your paper here, what you can do is dry your brush off and get all of the water off of your bristles, and then you can soak it up by dragging your brush along the bottom. Okay, so the next technique we're going to practice is wet on dry. So we're trying to achieve the same effect but with dry paper. This is important to have your paper inclined for this technique, and we're going to get some paint on our brush and start at the top, and you're just going to do one stroke at a time. Get some more paint on your brush, do another stroke right below it, and you'll notice that there will start to be a puddle forming at the bottom of your strokes, and the idea is that you're just slowly moving this puddle down the page. So as you can see, this is a much more controlled method and way of achieving a similar look. So now we're going to practice the same concept but around a shape. The goal is to keep the circle white. So we'll start with the wet on wet technique. So we will go ahead and get our paper wet and try and carefully paint around this circle shape. And then we will go ahead and add the pigment to the paint. So as you can see, the paint will move wherever the paper is wet. So you can help it along. You can even move your tray or move your paper around and see how it moves, which can be a fun practice. The nice thing as well with having your paper wet is it just gives you a lot more time to move the paint around with ease. Okay, so now we'll try this wet on dry technique around this shape over here. So we'll do the same thing. We'll start at the top, and then we'll slowly draw these lines and move around this circle shape. So with each line, I'm getting more paint on my brush, and then I'm coming back to the painting, and I'm trying not to take too long so that the paper doesn't dry in the middle of this process. Okay, so the pros and cons between these two techniques, again are that wet on wet is much more free and harder to control, but it's great on big spaces, and wet on dry is much more easy to control, but hard to do it fast enough if it's a big space. Okay, so now we're gonna do a gradient. So we'll have a strong color at the top, and then we will slowly fade it out to white at the bottom. So we're gonna start with getting our paper wet. And I'm gonna use a strong color at the top of the paper, like this. And then I'm going to rinse my brush off a little bit, but I won't dry it off. I won't completely take the pigment off. With more water on my brush, I will slowly move that down on the paper. And then I'm gonna dry off my brush here. I'm gonna soak up some of this water at the bottom so it doesn't keep. So like I said, especially because the paper is inclined, it's going to be a little more free flowing and a little bit harder to control. I'm trying to dry off some of this pigment from the bottom. So now we're gonna try the wet on dry technique to achieve a gradient. So we'll start off the same way with the darkest shade at the top. So now instead of getting more of this dark color on my brush and bringing that dark color down the paper, I'm going to get a little bit of water on my brush instead. So now I'm just going to keep rinsing my brush a little bit and keep bringing a lighter and lighter color down the paper. And by the end, I want to make sure I have almost no pigment left on my brush. And then just with water, bring down the rest of the color there. As you can see, this one started off great, but it is a little bit free flowing. You have to be more conscious of how much water you have on your paper. Whereas this one, it's a little bit easier to control. Now we're gonna talk about using multiple colors with these two techniques. First, we're going to mix two different colors together. Okay, so I'm going to mix two colors on my tray. So I'm going to have a warm yellow and then a red. Okay, so first I'm going to start with a wet on wet technique and get this square wet. So now I'm going to drop in multiple colors here on my paper and see how they blend. So in the same way as when you're just working with one color, if your paper is wet, then the colors and the paint will continue to blend. So this can be a really fun practice to keep adding pigment, seeing how it moves. You can see how it interacts with each other on the paper. And this is where watercolor can be very experimental and really playful. There aren't a lot of hard and fast rules when it comes to letting the pigment interact with each other. Okay, so now we're gonna do the same idea, but on wet on dry. So I'm gonna start with this yellow color on this side, and you can see already that the paint will go exactly where you want it to go. The only reason why it would drip is if you have a lot of paint on your paper. So those colors are not going to blend unless you actually make them touch. So wherever it touches and the paper is wet, so just in the center section here, that's where you'll have the color mixture blend. So that's the difference between using a wet on wet technique and a wet on dry technique. But technically, the wet on dry technique here is using a little bit of both, because you had wet on dry where it stayed exactly where it's supposed to be, and then when the colors met, that actually created a little bit of a wet on wet interaction. Okay, so now we're gonna try to achieve a color gradient with two colors. This is a really important skill to have because you're going to be using a lot of gradients in general with your art, especially if you're painting landscapes. You're always going to have a gradient with the sky of some kind, but gradients are everywhere. So it's really important to get this concept down. Our goal is to create a gradient from one color to another color within a small space. So we will start with having two colors that will blend nicely together. So if you did contrasting colors on your color wheel, that's fine, but they would be a little bit clashing. I will start with the blue on top, and then I will slowly make my way to a crimson color at the bottom. So first we're going to practice with the wet on wet technique, which means that we will start off with our paper wet as per usual, and we will start with a strong ultramarine blue color here. So now I am going to get a little bit of this blue and a little bit of this crimson and get like an in-between shade here. And then I'm gonna rinse off my brush and then go for the pure crimson at the bottom. And then so again, wet on wet is just very free, very fluid, and you have a lot of freedom and time to rework the gradient. So now we're gonna work with the wet on dry technique to achieve a multiple color gradient. So we will start with the blue, a very strong mixture of the blue. And now, instead of going back into the blue to get a consistent wash or to the water to get a gradient and a fade out, we're actually going to slowly add a little bit of this crimson color to the blue. So then each time I'm going to get a little bit more of this crimson on my brush. And then by the end, I might rinse my brush and make sure it's the pure crimson at the bottom. So that creates a very even gradient as well. We've basically talked about wet on wet and wet on dry in almost every capacity that you'll ever use it. Now we're going to talk about how to use both of these techniques simultaneously. So we're going to practice doing this in a single layer, and we're going to practice doing this on multiple layers and see the difference. Okay, so in this single layer, I'm going to do a demonstration of a tree to give you an understanding of how you can use wet on wet and wet on dry in one layer at the same time. I'm going to start with this blue color, and I'm going to create this. Actually, no, I take it back. I'm going to start with this crimson color, and I'm going to just create a basic tree shape like this. Okay, so that's like the trunk of the tree, if that's not clear. So this is a wet on dry technique to create these sharp lines on this tree. So now I'm going to use a wet on wet technique for the leaves. So I'm going to get all of the pigment off of my brush, and then just using water, I'm going to kind of create a cloud of where I would want my leaves to be. So then I'm going to let the water touch the branches of the tree a little bit, and now I'm going to just dab in where I want these leaves to be, and also just let the paint blend a bit. So now while this is still wet, I can continue using this wet on wet, and using a darker blue, I might create a bit of shadow in the tree. So along the bottom, I might add a little bit of blue to get some depth, and also on one side of the tree, I'm going to add more blue so that it looks shaded on this side. So then now down here, I can add a shade of the tree like that. So this would be, again, doing the wet on dry, because now I'm back on the grass. And then I can add more detail here, and only wherever I touch will it create a blend. Otherwise, it will stay sharp. All right, so that's a very, very minimal example of how you can use both of these techniques in a single layer. The pros of this are that you can create a very beautiful kind of sketch look, and you can actually do a lot just with one layer. Ideally, you would, if you're trying to get a realistic effect, you would want to use multiple layers using these techniques. So I'm going to show you how to do that on this side. Before I show you how to do the multiple layers, I want to show you a couple of ways to paint lines. So to get a consistent line on your paper, you can of course just paint it with using your wrist, but that can create more of a sketchy effect. The goal when you're painting a line is, say you're trying to do a long horizon line, is to actually use your entire arm and not just your wrist. So you will hold up your brush up and down just like this, and then you would base your wrist, but when you start painting, you will actually use your entire arm in one movement. So that creates a consistent line in how straight it is, but also in how, so that creates a consistent line in how straight it is, but also in how bold of a stroke it is. So you can do the same thing, but you can just push down harder on your brush to create a consistent, thicker line. So using this technique, you can play around with the variation of pressure. So you can start off light, and then you can push down, and then you can lift up again. And this is actually a very nice way of creating a wave effect on water, is playing with how much pressure you use. And you can also play with this technique in a million different ways. So for instance, to create a palm tree, you would start off pushing down strongly with your brush, and then as you lift up your brush going outward, you can create sort of an effect of tree branches. The main point is experiment a lot, try. It's really important to have a scratch paper so you can try things out on before you start on your pieces, especially when you're doing a very detailed piece. So this is an example of how lines look when it's wet on dry. You get these sharp, crisp lines. Now I just wanted to show you a very simple demonstration of how lines look when it's wet on wet. And when you have your paper wet and you're trying to create these lines, it will continue to blend, which probably wasn't a huge surprise. So it's important to know when to use which one. Okay, so now we're going to use some of these little tips in this last little section here. Okay, so on this side, I'm going to start with wet on wet. That I cannot even really see. In this section, we're going to talk about using both wet on wet and wet on dry in multiple layers. Let's do a little ocean scene on this side, and I can give you a better idea of what I mean. So we will start off with doing a wash with wet on wet. And I'm going to paint around a tiny sun. So I'm going to start off with some purple on my brush, and I'm going to create a wash. And then I'm going to have a little bit of a color gradient here. While this is still wet, I'm going to do something called color lifting. So I'm going to get my brush really dry, and using a dry brush, I'm going to go here and do some reverse waves. And using my brush while it's dry, it actually lifts off some of the color. And you can also do this with a paper towel to get a little bit of a different texture. And then I'm going to try and get a horizon line doing this technique as well. Okay, so that kind of just creates a little bit of texture in this bottom half and gives it a little bit of a watery look. Just for demonstration purposes, I will use a little bit of paper towel and lift off a little bit from the top. And you can see the paper towel adds a bit of a texture, and this can be really handy to with clouds actually. Okay, so while the paper is still wet, I'm going to do this line technique of wet on wet with a darker blue. So I'm going to follow the parts that I already lifted the color off and just add a shadow underneath it. Okay, Before I do anything else, I need to make sure my paper is fully dry, and then I'm going to be able to add some sharper details. Now that my paper is dry, it kind of resets your paper. So now I could paint anywhere and have these sharp lines because now it's wet on dry again, unless I add enough water to make it wet on wet. So here I am going to add just a couple of details to this piece, and I'm also going to use a darker color than the background. So this is what I mean when I talk about using the value scale, where we start with lighter colors in the beginning, and then we are slowly working our way to these darker colors at the end. Now I'm going to add a couple of these waves with the wet on dry technique. And I'm going to follow these hints of a shadow that I already painted. So in the foreground, you tend to want to paint bigger. And then in the background, things tend to get a little bit smaller as they go. Okay, so now we have a bit of a water effect here. So now I can also add other details like maybe a couple birds or even a boat. So usually when you're starting your last layers, you want to remember to switch to a smaller brush because you'll have a lot more control. Basically, you can always go darker, but you can't get lighter. So that's kind of what we talked about in the beginning, but I think it's just helpful to see an example of that. And then why not? We'll add a little bit of an island here, and we'll practice some of those palm trees I already showed you. Well, first I'll start with the trunks of the trees, and I'll do a couple like that, and then I will switch to my medium-sized brush, and then you're going to push down at the center of the palm tree head, and then you lift up as you go out. Just a nice little trick to create a tree effect without having to paint every single little leaf. Sometimes suggestion is more powerful than actually painting every detail. And oftentimes that's why people are more connected to abstract or impressionistic paintings, because it allows space for your imagination to fill in the gaps. These are two examples of how you'd use wet on wet and wet on dry and with single layer versus multiple layers. So you can see using multiple layers, you get more of a realistic effect and you get a little bit more depth. Whereas the single layer, you can create a lot of drama and a lot of interest, but unless you're extremely talented and have a lot of practice, it can be hard to create a realistic effect within a single layer. I just wanted to show you two last techniques, which I rarely ever use, but it's just nice to know what they are in case you would ever need them. So we have wet on dry, but then we also have dry on wet and dry on dry. And these two techniques are more of a texture effect, so they're not used very often, but for example, I have a dry brush here. I'm just gonna go straight for the paint, so my brush is very dry right now. And I'm just gonna go straight for the dry paper. So you can see it creates kind of this like dry effect. And this can be useful to create a little bit of texture like on the trunk of trees or sand or something like that. So there's like a time and a place to use that, but you know, whatever, it's good to know. And dry on wet is a similar feeling, but it just blends a little bit. So you have your wet paper and you have a very dry brush. Oops, not dry enough. Okay, so that's more accurate, where you'd see it's like you're almost pulling the pigment straight on the paper. And it blends a little bit, but yeah, these can create certain effects in certain settings, and it's just nice to have in your arsenal. As you can see, even your practice can be beautiful. I would encourage you to experiment with the medium. Be sure to label what you did to know how to achieve those different looks, because maybe you really like this gradient, but you couldn't remember how you did it. But then you can look, oh yeah, it's a gradient, and I did wet on dry.
So the main thing to remember are those two techniques, the wet on wet and wet on dry. And I hope that this video gave you a little bit more confidence in knowing when to use which one and when to combine them. But don't feel like you have to remember everything and remember all of the terms. I will definitely refresh you in my other videos. But I just wanted to create space to deep dive into some of these foundational topics and getting a little bit more of an understanding into color theory, color mixing, and a couple fundamental techniques. I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you in my next painting videos. I'm a watercolor and acrylic painter. If you like my work, feel free to check out my website. I have prints and other things for sale. I also offer private classes, so if you'd like more of a personal one-on-one course, message me and we can work it out.